What's up, hobby friends? My name is Casey and welcome to another miniature rescue. This week we're going to be taking a look at one of the worst minis in my collection and trying to save it. This video is sponsored by Fume, but more on that in a little bit. I've purchased so many models on eBay during my time in the hobby, and while I am specifically searching out the ones that need an exceptional amount of help, there are just some that I honestly am not sure how to deal with. A couple of years ago, I ended up buying a khorne army off of eBay that I dubbed the absolute worst. It was pretty bad. There were several reasons for this, but I want to emphasize that none of those reasons were due to the way that they were previously painted. Paint isn't that difficult to take off of a mini, usually. You plop them into some concentrated degreaser or a sonic cleaner, and the paint melts away, usually. But the army I am talking about, and subsequently the model we will be looking at today, leaving the models in a much worse than average state. The army ended up being a massive undertaking, and something that I am still very happy with the end result, even now. There are still problems with the models, but giving them a good cleaning and a fresh paint job turned them into playable models for sure. This Slaughterpriest, a mortal khorne bloodbound model for Age of Sigmar, is one of the last models I have left from that army, and it represents a part of that project that is still unfinished, and I've been staring at it since completing that video a pretty long time ago at this point. The real issue here is twofold. The paint that's left is very textured, and I don't know how much of that is because of the partial stripping previously, or from the primer, or even what the plastic looks like underneath it. The second issue is that when I originally stripped these models, the paint really didn't want to come off. It was very stuck on, and I have a feeling it may have been some kind of enamel or harder paint than just your average acrylic. The other thing is some of the models from that army were kind of melted. I'm assuming from something like a long acetone bath gone wrong, which brings up a good point. Don't put your minis into acetone unless they are 100% made of metal. There have been plenty of people over the years that have told horror stories, and I'm sure there are plenty of us who thought that it's gonna be just fine, and it just wasn't. So I think these might have just gone in and everything melted together. Here's the model. You can see there's still a lot of paint left over and a ton of texture that looks baked into the model. I'm hoping that the plastic isn't ruined underneath this paint, but either way, we're gonna get the paint off and take a closer look. If the plastic is gone, then the plan will need to be adjusted. So let's get this guy into the sonic cleaner and see what happens. I honestly don't know how this is gonna go. But before that, let me tell you about today's excellent sponsor. Cold turkey may be great on sandwiches, but there's a better way to break your bad habits. We're not talking about using some magic liquid that makes you a world-class painter. No oil. We're talking about our sponsor, Fume, and they look at the problem in a different way. Not everything in a bad habit is wrong. So instead of a drastic, uncomfortable change, why not just remove the bad from your habit? Fume is an innovative, award-winning flavored air device that does just that. Instead of electronics, Fume is completely natural. Instead of vapor, Fume uses flavored air. And instead of harmful chemicals, Fume uses all-natural, delicious flavors. You get it. Instead of bad, Fume is good. And it's a habit you're free to enjoy and make replacing your bad habit easy. It fills the void in a natural, guilt-free way. Your Fume comes with an adjustable airflow dial and is designed with movable parts and magnets for fidgeting, giving your fingers a lot to do, which is helpful for de-stressing while breaking your habit. Base was launched in January. It's a weighted stand to rest your Fume on when not in use, with a magnet inside that keeps your Fume attached. The Fume device can be spun around on it, which is also good for fidgeting. Personally, I was surprised by how much the clicking and spinning and popping of the metal parts actually, helped me calm down and focus on what I was doing. It's very satisfying to hold and feel the weight of in your hand while you're doing other things. Stopping is something that we all put off because it's hard, but switching to Fume is easy, enjoyable, and even fun. Fume has served over 150,000 customers and has thousands of success stories. There's no reason that can't be you. Join Fume in accelerating humanity's breakup from destructive habits by picking up the Journey Pack today. Head to tryfume.com/ebayminiature or scan the QR code and use code ebayminiature to get 10% off when you get the Journey Pack today. That's tryfum.com and use code ebayminiature to save an additional 10% off your order today. Once again, thanks to Fume for sponsoring this video and miniature painters. Now let's get back to that khorne Slaughterpriest. After getting this guy into the sonic cleaner and running him for quite some time, I could tell that the paint just wasn't going to come up like it was supposed to. Whatever this mini has gone through has really baked that paint into the plastic, and I really struggled to get this clean as much as it needs to be to have a smooth paint job. I ended up scrubbing it down and running it for even more cycles after scrubbing, running, scrubbing, trying to take each part and really get in there and get that paint off. Each time he went into the bath, a little more paint came off, so I just kept repeating the process. I want to say another 6 or 7 times before I felt a little better with the progress. After getting everything out, I started to clean up the model with an X-Acto blade, finding those mold lines and a few pieces of excess plastic that were left over from the sprue and just shaving them down to get the plastic looking as smooth as possible. Because the model had been soaking and gone through the cleaning process so many times, it did make the glue a lot easier to separate. So I was able to take the model apart and get into some of the harder to reach areas. All in all, it's not the best looking paint stripped model. I did reassemble the model using plastic glue and use that to try and smooth out some of those rougher surfaces. Plastic glue melts high impact polystyrene. That's how they get glued together. And when you use it on top of the plastic, it can help smooth out the rougher surfaces and blend some of the harsher lines. It's something that I do pretty often when kit bashing and converting models, so it makes sense that doing that here would help some of those textures on the plastic. Up close you can see how much of an issue the texture is on this model. Some nasty lines and textures that are actually in the plastic. I definitely do think that this had a bath in some kind of nail polish remover at some point, and it just melted the paint and plastic together, giving it this look. Now, I really don't run into this issue very often, but for the models that I have seen, there really isn't anything to do but run with it and try and make it a part of the model. We can do a lot with paint and sell things, so I'm going to try and do that with some of the pieces on this guy. In particular, the skin and cloth have lots of extra texture and bubbling, so painting it with that texture in mind will hopefully make it look more purposeful. In the end, this is a game piece, and it doesn't need to be perfect, but using texture and painting in that texture will make it look more like it was meant to be that way in the first place. I also want to prep the base that I made for him and get that set up for paint as well. For the base, I went with a super cool base topper from Zabavka Workshop over on my mini factory. The other models in this army have a cracked khorne symbol and spikes that I printed out a long time ago, and I do like those. But this being a larger and more heroic character, I want to give him a nicer base, so I painted out this neat spiked base that has some skulls and rock structure on it. It ended up not quite fitting right with the way that the legs work on this model. He's kind of standing on a little skull too, but a little cutting away and we get a nice platform for him, and he can stand there and be incorporated with the existing details. A little sandy paint to cover up the cutaway resin, and I think this will do very well for this guy and fitting into this army. Then they both get primer and we're pretty much ready to see if any of this is going to end up working at all. Starting right into the paint job, I'm going to lay down a zenithal of white ink over the top. This is going to pick up the muscle detail in particular and make it easier to see those shapes when we get to the brushwork. In order to get a more varied skin tone, I went in with some blue and green with the airbrush. This really sets up the skin to feel much more alive, and while a lot of it does get covered up in the end, you can see little glimpses of these colors in the overall skin tone, and it looks pretty nice. Now that we have a pre-shade going, it's time to bring in some of the actual skin tone. I started with a mid-tone pinkish color and moved up to a desaturated pale skin, really trying to aim for the larger muscle groups and shooting it from the top down to pick up all the great detail on the sculpt. You can start to see how damaged this model is now. There's some pitting in the plastic and texture that is coming through. The plastic glue did a pretty great job at smoothing out some of the finer stuff, but it's still not the best it could be. I mean, it is a used model after all. Still, I'm going to try and cover it up as much as I can and continue to paint. Next up, I'm going to take advantage of that zenithal layer and put some Flesh Tear's Red contrast over all of the armor panels. Through the airbrush or brushed on, this color is both deep and transparent, so you get a very nice red that has those transitions still intact. It would have been easier to just brush this on, but to cover up some of that texture on the skin, I'm going to let the overspray from the airbrush do an actual job. The small texture from that overspray gives parts in the skin a kind of blood spattered look, and it makes it hard to see the bad plastic. It's kind of covered up with the same types of texture. So it's just doing us a favor when we wouldn't normally want it at all. Moving up to a brighter red and orange, I do want to try and limit the overspray too much. So I take my time and get highlights on the cloak and brighter spots on top of the armor panels. Now that there are some nice base coats and highlights on most of the model, I'm going to use dark silver and block out all of the trim and metallic parts of the model. There's also a lot of leather on this guy, so I decided to go with brown leather and scratch it up. Again, hiding any imperfections in the model by creating texture. So a darker brown to start, I'll follow that up with lighter orange brown and an off-white mixed in to create highlights and scratches. For the skin, I want to get a lot more definition going, so I thinned down some dark purple and started glazing that into the shadows. This step is pretty slow going, lots and lots of layers, one after the other has dried to start to tint that skin tone down. The good thing is, glazing over a pale skin tone is a lot easier than trying to just brighten them up with a lighter color, so you can really see the effect of this paint pretty quickly. It just takes a whole bunch of layers to get that color to really stand out, to become more opaque. In particular, the arms are going to get a bunch of this paint. I really want the hands to transition into a dark purple, red, bruised color. I think that looks really cool, and it should blend some of that overspray that looks like a mistake right now. After more than a few coats, you can definitely see what I mean on the hands. The sword hand has a good gradient going on, and you can see a lot of that texture from the airbrush underneath. Just a pretty cool looking hand. And it hides a lot of that bad plastic. I still want to define a lot of the detail on the skin, so I sparingly add some pale flesh with the brush to that detail. This will pull out the little tears and scars all over his body and give the final highlight on the brighter points near the top of the model. I decided to bring in a lot more blue into this model than I originally anticipated. I really wanted it to fit in with the rest of the army, so I ended up glazing in some aethermatic blue contrast on the metallic parts. The sword has these nice jagged broken up pieces on it, so I decided to lay that color down in the shadowy parts of those areas. The plan will be to edge highlight and scratch up all the metal with a brighter silver later on, so it looks kind of weird right now, but once these pieces get a bright frame around them, you can really see the effect. It's kind of like doing non-metallic metal, but with colors over actual metallic paint. pretty fun process, and I actually really like the end result. To really sell that effect, I'm going to bring in some bright silver and edge highlight all of those metallic pieces. This really boxes in that color and gives them a more NMM look. I also want to add texture to those pieces with the same silver, so little scratches on all of the metal to help hide any of that bad plastic. The last thing that needs to be done is to get this guy onto the base. The feet don't exactly sit flat, so I needed to fill in some of the gaps with more of that mud texture. But after laying that down and getting more of that pigment powder over the top of it, it was looking pretty good. Sometimes you run into models that are next to impossible to fix. It's hard to see in an eBay listing all of the issues that you're buying, and this model was one of the worst I've run into in a long time. The paint just took forever to come off, and even then it still had a ton of pitting and kind of melty parts on it. Some of the pieces aren't put on properly, and there are pieces bent or broken or didn't fit together well anymore. Still, taking some time to paint around issues that are presented, leaning into texture, and painting a model to look like those things are on purpose can end up working out really well. In this case, I'm actually pretty happy with how this model turned out. The issues were known, and I did my best to work around them, and I feel like they at least make sense for what the model is. It goes to show that even when a model is in really rough shape, you can still do something about it. With a little bit of work, it's still very much a usable and playable model, and it will most definitely bring me joy playing it on the tabletop and in a fun game of Warhammer. Just remember that sometimes you run into problems and you find models that aren't in the best shape, but that just doesn't mean that they're something you should throw away. They have a use either as terrain or statues or whatever else you can think of that could add to your game. So all models are worth something. They're worth saving at least. And I'm sure you can think of an awesome way to use those busted up models. Thank you again for joining me on another miniature rescue. If you like something about this video, please consider hitting that like button, sharing this video with your hobby friends, and of course, subscribing for more miniature rescues. Once again, I'm Casey, and I will see you in the next video. And of course, here is the completed khorne Slaughterpriest. Thanks again.